The January transfer window has closed, and so today I'm joined by JJ Bull.
Hello.
And Jon Mackenzie.
Also hello.
In order to repredict the Premier League. Again. For a third time. Okay, before we begin talking about teams, let's take a look at what you did after 10 games of the Premier League season. You already made some changes here from before the first game had been played. The obvious things I'm spotting in both of your tables, you both have Tottenham in 5th, which is not the case, and you both have Man United in 7th, which also isn't the case. There's some other movement here, which we're going to discuss, but reaction to that, JJ?
I couldn't control that some sort of evil witch would put a curse upon the Spurs players to injure them all.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would have been correct.
And your reaction, Jon?
We all thought that Manchester United would bring in a new manager who would turn things around. However, that didn't happen.
No, it didn't. It really didn't, did it? Anyway, we're going to see your new tables when we get to the end of the episode. But between now and then, we're going to work our way through and talk about teams where things have changed in a couple of different sections. The first one is the transfer impacted section. And there are a handful of teams here. I'm going to start with you, JJ, and we're going to chat about Tottenham first. Because of all the big teams, Tottenham had a rather sizable January transfer window, didn't they?
They brought in a couple of players, yes, and they needed to because, as I've alluded to or just said, they had all their players injured by some sort of curse. And so when they don't have their first 11, it's a big problem, but the real big issue has been in their centre-backs who've been injured the entire time, because you need to have at least 2 in your team at any given moment, and they've been playing Archie Gray, who I think will probably end up being a midfielder, and people like Jed Spence has even had to come in, Ben Davies has been there, so that's been a big issue for them. But they've also brought in a player they can play along the front line, who should give them a bit more depth, and also could potentially turn into like a future superstar as well. And I can tell you about who those players are, and whether they're good or not, if you would like.
I would like that, yes.
Well, that's convenient, because here's a graphic about Mathys. This is his FBref profile, and what he is a very, very high potential young French player who can play anywhere across the front. He was mostly used as a substitute striker for Bayern Munich as a centre forward, but he's actually played mostly off the left, and I give you his pros and cons. So obviously for Spurs, it's useful. He can play anywhere across the front. I think he'd probably lean towards being a left winger because he's not quite got all the things you need for a striker yet. He's quick. He's not the quickest. He's got real presence, I would say. Like, he looks like a big lad on the pitch. He doesn't always use his body the way he probably could do, so he can develop with that. Great technique, really good dribbler, but again, not the best at everything. So he's quite raw, will definitely turn into a good player. But the things you see him do that are cons, I would say, are his decision making. So in the final third especially, quite predictable. Mostly looks for a little 1-2 in the edge of the box that then breaks down moves. You can kind of You can block him off and defend him quite easily, but he's a good player and so produces things now and again. His highlights reel looks really good, but when he plays in games and he doesn't affect it early, he tends to go missing. So, but because he's young, he'll normally be inconsistent anyway, but could turn into a big player in the future.
I guess he would usually then perhaps be on the bench behind Son, or maybe, I mean, he's an alternative to Timo Werner?
Well, good squad option because you can play him as the replacement for Solanke, but I think he has to learn a lot about the role. Like, being involved in the game as a centre forward is hard. Knowing when to drop, when to pin someone, how to be aggressive and use your physicality. What you'll see a lot of Tell is that if he starts wide, he wants to come inside to attack these central areas, which is what Son does. But what you really want with Postecoglou is to keep the width from this left side, because a lot of the attacking threat will come from underlapping runs from either a midfielder or the left wing back, full back will come up and join in there. So it's not exactly perfect tactically, but I don't think it really matters. And we saw at Celtic, he would often play attacking players who would attack centrally from that left side as well. So it's possible to use that. But the real problem is, I would say, at centre back. Obviously,
there's a real problem.
Yes, they have none. They have minus centre backs. Right. So now they have an extra one. So they're levelling out with centre backs.
Okay.
Kevin Danso, I think he'll be a good squad player. Again, pros and cons with Danso. He is a centre back with 2 working legs. Yep. Useful for Spurs. They need those.
Pro.
Quick, which is useful because they play a high line. They play at the halfway line an awful lot of the time. So you saw even against like Everton recently, who are just playing long balls at the top. Calvert-Lewin's getting in behind them because you can do that when you play such a high line. So someone with speed is useful. Yeah. He is, as you want to have any Premier League centre-back to be, strong, he's big, he can win lots of aerial duels, his numbers show that he does that sort of thing.
Pro.
And he's a proactive defender, he goes and seeks out the danger and takes care of it early.
There were 2 pros in there, I think.
Yes, there's a few pros. However, the thing is, he does make errors under pressure when passing. He tends to make safe passes. His highlights have lots of big long passes, but if you actually watch him make all the long passes, not all of them are good. But I think a good squad option, he was available, they got him for a decent price. I think that's a decent signing.
I assume you're going to say this makes them better.
I don't know how much better these players will actually make them, but they will help them have better depth. And so because other players will return from injury, I think Spurs will climb up the table from their precarious position.
Well, stick around, viewer, to find out where JJ says Tottenham are going to be a little bit later on in this episode. Before then, though, John, let me come to you and ask you with Manchester City. They're another team that have spent quite a lot of money in January. It's not clear to me whether that money is spent for now to save their season or if this is just them looking to the future.
I think it's definitely them looking to the future. That this is, them rebuilding their squad, and we've talked all the way through this season about how their squad isn't at the level that they want it to be. But I think what I find so interesting about this is, even though some of these players are clearly future players, will their introduction into the squad actually mean that City turn their season around anyway? And the reason I think that is because actually Manchester City's tactical approach is quite, I would say, coherent insofar as like every part of it coheres in the other parts of it. So I've drawn like a really simple graph here, which just shows the four phases roughly of what City are trying to do with the ball. So they progress the ball, they get the ball, they try and move it down the field, and then possess it high, try and break down the low block. If they lose the ball, they then counter press to try and stop a defensive transition from occurring. If that doesn't happen, then they defensive transition. They then try and win the ball back and then get back into progress. But the issue here is that because it's so coherent, as soon as one thing goes wrong, it has knock-on impacts elsewhere. So we get this sort of cascade effect that you start doing one thing badly and it makes it harder to do the other thing that you do so well. So that means as soon as something goes wrong, everything can go quite badly wrong quite quickly, which is what we've seen happening this season. And the big question in my head is whether or not they can flip that around by making things slightly better. Does that mean that you then have this cascade effect in the other direction where it makes things better? That's all theoretical right now, so I thought it'd be good to give you a sequence that shows you how this sort of plays out on the pitch. So this is the third goal that Spurs score against Manchester City. And this is like one of the best examples of like everything going wrong for City in terms of the circle we've just talked about. So I've started it off in the possession phase. So this is them trying to possess the ball high up. But actually they haven't been able to do that very well, and Phil Foden ends up just having to sort of play a fairly speculative pass into Bernardo Silva that ends up getting turned over here. Now at this point, this is when you move from we've not managed to possess the ball very well high up the field into we need to counter press. But possessing the ball high up the field phase is important because it sets you up for your counter press. And actually if we look at the positions that we see the Manchester City players in, we can see that because they haven't possessed the ball well, they aren't able to counter press well. Because if we look at the three Manchester City midfielders, so Rico Lewis, Gundogan and Bernardo Silva here, when the ball comes back out, they are really badly positioned to counter press. They have bad access to the ball. Now, Phil Foden is there. Phil Foden is one of the wide players in this game, and also not the sort of player that you want to have as your immediate counter pressing piece. He misses the ball and then it becomes very much a problem because none of those City players are anywhere near good enough in terms of access to the ball. If we look at the Spurs players, however, around the ball, we can see that there's four players there closer to the ball than the next Manchester City player. So already you can see that because they've not possessed the ball well, their counter press is not going to go well. Phil Foden misses the ball, and despite the fact that there are players around, the Manchester City midfielders don't get any closer to the ball at this moment, so Kulusevski can pick the ball up quite nicely, get it under control possession really easily, and then what starts happening from here is just a series of Manchester City players having to move large distances to try and close the ball down, which puts them at a disadvantage because these players can use the momentum of those City players to get around them. So Gundogan here is the first one who goes in, and as you can see, when Gundogan arrives, he's having to jump into the tackle. Kulusevski can just flick it through him, and he gets into open space. But what we start seeing there is a series of Man City players now who just aren't prepared whatsoever for this transitional play. So this is Kyle Walker here. He's not moved since the original ball was lost. And then once the ball has gone through Gundogan's legs, he's like, well, I'm going to have to start sorting myself out here. He does the same thing that Gundogan does, which is run with momentum towards the ball, miss it, and then Kulusevski can get around him.
He ran all the way to Milan, didn't he?
He did, eventually, yes. So this is him here, that he only starts moving towards the ball once that tackle is broken. And then from this point, he runs past Kulusevski, and he has two options here. He can either go towards Son here, who Kulusevski has passed the ball to, or he can track Kulusevski's run. And I guess part of his decision-making should be, well, Akanji is here, so he's on Son. I'll track the run with Kulusevski. But he actually decides to try and tackle Son. All Son then has to do is just flick the ball through into the channel, and Kulusevski is now in a 1v1 against the centre-back. So the counter-press has failed considerably, and this leads then to another problem, because now Manchester City have to move into that defensive transition phase.
Yeah.
And then we start seeing problems emerging here as well. So this is Gundogan and Son running back for the ball. By the time the ball is played into the box by Kulusevski, you can see the amount of separation that Son has created from Gundogan. And this is happening for City's opponents all the time now, because what they're able to do is generate these overloads in the box just by having these defensive transitions, knowing their players are going to be faster, so that they will end up with more players in attacking positions than Man City. So if we look at the bottom of the picture here, we can see two Spurs players running in, completely unmarked, and what's going to happen is that Solanke is going to get the ball. All he has to do then is roll it into the feet of Porro, who can then play the ball into the goal. So what we've seen here is like three of those phases that we're talking about causing other problems in the next phase. There's that cascade effect of things going wrong in one area leading to things going wrong in another area. Just got a bit of data to round this out to show you what's going wrong, because what we can see here is City in defensive transition aren't able to get enough good recovery runs in. I've actually got some photo vision data which shows their recovery runs this season. So this is the raw number of their recovery runs. This is a number of those recovery runs by forwards, and this is the recovery runs by midfielders. Recovery runs are just any defensive transition where you're going out of the opposition's half into your own half and you hit 25 kilometres an hour.
So their midfielders make fewer than every other team in the Premier League?
That's right. And now you might say, well, this is Manchester City. They're going to possess the ball more than other teams. So they are probably going to want to make fewer recovery runs than their opponents. But if we even look back to last season Manchester City were bang on the average for recovery runs. When it came to recovery runs by forwards, they were in the top 5. And so obviously they've dropped right down there. And then the recovery runs by midfielders, they've dropped from sort of lower mid-table right to the bottom. Right. So clearly this is an issue that is being exacerbated by some of the other issues further upfield. You can't counter-press well. You're going to have to do more recovery runs. But Manchester City are in a situation where they're now actually doing fewer recovery runs. And then this then has another cascading effect, because if you're not actually great in those defensive transition scenarios, what ends up happening is that your back line is going to start sitting a little bit deeper. If you're having to do loads of recovery runs, you're like, well, I'm not going to step forward, because if I do that, every step forward I take is another step that I have to run back in recovery.
And that would be annoying.
Yeah, and you know, these things are really important. Manchester City here, this is last season, this is their defensive line height. You can see 43 metres away from their own goal, which is higher than Arsenal and Liverpool. And as you can see, what they've got here is like really good compaction. This is why it's so important for defensive lines to stand high, because the higher you stand, the smaller the space you're making, which means that there's less space for you to actually have to counter-press. So what we're seeing then this season is that line has dropped by 2 metres, which may not sound like a huge amount, but actually if you look at the compaction across the whole pitch, you can see that they've lost around 4 metres because their forward line is 2 metres further forward as well. So what they're doing is, because they're bad at defensive transition, it actually means that they're making the pitch even bigger because their defensive line is sitting deeper. That then means that they're going to be less able to do good counter-pressing. And that means that they're more likely to have to do more of those defensive transitions. So you can see that this cascade effect of two things going a little bit wrong, leading to other problems elsewhere. I just wanted to end with one final viz, because this isn't just about defending, this is also about attacking as well. Because if you're having to defend more space, one of the ways that you might try and solve that is by being careful to make sure that your players aren't leaving that central space that you're counter-pressing. So that means that when you're attacking with the ball, you might be less likely to make runs in behind, because if you make a run in behind, what you're doing is, yes, you're trying to create more space for you to be able to exploit when you're attacking, but you're also creating more space for you to then defend if you lose the ball. And so we can see this in the data. Again, this is from Photo Vision. If we look at the runs in behind that City were making last season compared to this season, City's players are just not finding those runs in behind as much. And I think in part that is because they're scared of actually having these moments where players evacuate the middle of the field, lose the ball, and then they have to counter-press a massive area. So we can see runs in behind last season in the top 5. This season they've dropped way below average, and runs in behind in build-up. So that's what we're talking about, the ability to control space, to exploit it when you have the ball. Obviously, Man City are using those runs in behinds in order to create that space. You force the opposition backline deeper, and you also often drag players out of the middle. They're not doing that so much anymore, which means it's harder for them to progress and possess the ball, which then means that they're going to end up in these scenarios where they're losing the ball more. And so again, that cascade effect goes round and round and round. So I think the big question that I have is whether or not we think that the players that City have brought in, just by dint of the fact that they're going to improve a lot of these ideas that we're talking about, are then going to immediately have that opposite cascade effect where everything gets just a little bit easier, a little bit better.
Well, we've talked about the players that they brought in earlier in January at length already. The player I haven't heard you speak about too much yet is Nico Gonzalez, who they brought in towards the end of January. I've heard you describe him as a sort of Rodri-light character with maybe the potential to grow into that, who knows. Is Nico Gonzalez the kind of player that's going to help resolve this issue this season? Or, I mean, put it this way, where have they moved up or down in your prediction?
Yeah, I think all of the signings that they've made will improve what I'm talking about here. So even just in terms of the runs behind, we've seen Omar Marmoush come in, and he is able to make those runs and manipulate the space and create space to make it easier to possess the ball. I think then throwing someone like Nico Gonzalez in means that you've got a player who's going to have more physicality than Kovacic and Gundogan, which is part of the big reason why City are struggling so much in counter-pressing and in defensive transition. If you bring in Gonzalez, does that mean that Marmoush is then going to be more confident making those runs in behind to create more space because he knows that he's going to be covered by Gonzalez? I think that sort of thing is definitely just going to be immediately true. The big question with Nico Gonzalez, I suppose, is more from the in-possession side of things, like how well will he scale up to do the sorts of things that Rodri can do? Yeah. And as we saw, Rodri took a season to get to grips with that side of things anyway. Yeah. But I just think by dint of the fact that he's a younger player who's 6'2", he's got physicality, he'll just improve them in those sorts of moments. So already you're then thinking, okay, well, we'll be doing less of those really dangerous defensive transitions. We'll maybe be able to possess the ball a little bit more functionally. And then we've got those two young centre-backs that they brought in as well, Kusanov and Raish as well. And I think, again, what you're doing with them is you're saying, well, they're young players, they'll have the physicality to be able to do those defensive runs back. So maybe they'll have the confidence then to push forward to make the pitch even smaller so that it's easy to counter press. So that's what I'm saying about these sort of these cascading effects that we will start to see. What it's been for City this season is quite a vicious circle where one thing's gone wrong, it's led to bigger problems in another area, and round it goes. I think what we could see is like potentially a bit more of a virtuous circle this rest of the season, with those things sort of starting to sort themselves out. So I think on balance, I would say they'll probably be slightly better in the second half of the season than they've been in the first half, but it's a question of what level that improvement comes at. You
did predict them to win after 10 games. I assume you don't think that's going to happen still.
No, I mean, my logic then, I suppose, was more after 10 games, City, they were still doing okay, roughly speaking, at that point, and Arsenal had dropped off, and so I was just going with the conservative option. But yeah, I'm not got City winning the league right now.
We've got him going back over old logic already, JJ. You, of course, also predicted them to win. Come back later to find out how far down their predicted tables Manchester City have slipped. And next on to Aston Villa, JJ, another team that did big business in January. The main question I have for you, I suppose, is does Rashford fit in really on loan there? Disasi as well. I mean, what do you think, and how does it impact where you predicted them to finish after 10 games?
Well, the Rashford one is really interesting and is something I'm not quite sure about, but we can explore and discover what we think. So if we look at what Aston Villa look like, this is just some random players in their first 11. This is roughly what it looks like, but we know they want underlapping runs. We know that left back can probably push up. There's lots of different things this team will do, but what we know they definitely need is more goals, because if you look at just the goal scorers in the Premier League this season, Ollie Watkins has 10, John Duran has 7, he's gone. He's not there anymore.
Gone Duran.
He's gone away.
Gone Duran.
And that's 7 goals they're missing. So the next top scorer is Morgan Rogers, who plays through the middle mostly, or sometimes out left. This is making underlapping runs that they like having either side of Watkins. Then below that, it's just nothing. So they need more goals. They need more attacking players in. And they've brought in quite a few, actually. Because it's not just Rashford. Did you know they also brought in Marco Asensio?
Yes.
From PSG. Good.
I knew.
Did you know they brought in Daniel Malin?
I did know that.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you know they brought in Andres Garcia?
No.
Yes. And also Axel Disasi. So Disasi's, I think, kind of an easy one, and a lot of the problems they have, thanks to Sam Tive, there's information, by the way, a lot of the problems that Aston Villa have had is their PSR and like their spending regulations. Basically, they're in trouble a lot of the time. So what Monchi is trying to deal with all their transfers is trying to do is make them a bit better, or just keep them at the same level the entire time, whilst also making some profit. And they made a lot of profit in the window. I think it's like 64 million, something like that. They sold about 90 million worth of players, John Duran being the biggest example of that. But what you get is that Diego Carlos is gone, so you can play Disasi in this left side because Pau Torres is injured all the time, it seems. So you get this sort of thing here. You get Andres Garcia, gives you back up to cash, which you didn't really have, really. And then in midfield, they've got some decent players there, but this thing with Rogers, Ramsey and Bailey. So Bailey's not been great, hasn't scored that much. Rogers and Ramsey can both play through the middle, but they both come inside because it's what you end up a lot of the time is this sort of shape here, where Digne will push up and you get this sort of attacking shape, really, this sort of thing here. But where does Rashford particularly fit into this? Because we've seen him play up front for Man United, and what he would do for Aston Villa if he plays here is drag defenders wide to create space for someone to run through. He could do that, but I don't think he's great through the middle ever. He does okay. You could play him out wide left, but he wants to come and attack these spaces here. But what Emery likes to do is keep these spaces clear so you can attack the spaces. If you occupy them, the space is gone. So actually, if we look at how they play, where he might fit in, we can have a little look. So here is Aston Villa playing against Arsenal as an example of the kind of the front five shape that most teams will have. You get the width from Mathys here and Luca Digne here, because you play your wide midfielders are playing through the middle really. Either side of Watkins, you might be able to create something. So Rashford could play here, but that's the left back. That's not really going to happen. He's probably more likely to want to be here, which is what they tried to do briefly under Ruben Amorim at Man United. I don't think he's very good at it. Doesn't know when to drop. He wants to play higher than you want him to. Emery wants his players to drop a little bit deeper and make runs in behind.
One thing that's been very impressive about Emery to me is his ability to improve strikers. I remember those, all those stories about Ollie Watkins.
Yeah.
Maybe Marcus Rashford could learn.
He's 27 and quite not set in his ways. You can probably change, right? But the things he does are the things he does really well, and it tends to be that you come off the left to attack those central spaces. That's just what he does best.
I think he'll give clarity, right? I think that's what Emery does, because his system is so sort of clear in Emery's head. What he does is he gets the strikers playing in the positions where they're going to be most dangerous. So I remember very early on in his time, Watkins talking about how he was encouraged to stay in between the lines of the box of the penalty area, because that's what the manager was saying, you're going to score from that area, so don't move out of it. And I think we might see a similar thing with Rashford. I guess maybe for me the difference between Rashford is, like, Rashford for me is a very transitional player, so he thrives in those sorts of moments where he can find space in behind, which that it will happen in these sorts of systems. A big part of what Emery's trying to do is generate those sort of artificial transition moments. So I could see it maybe working, but at the same time, it's the other areas that you would maybe worry about a little bit more with Rashford, the sort of things that you want your striker to do when you're playing against a low block and you're having to do link up and hold up play. That sort of means that I think that he'll have a very specific kind of game that he'll be used in as a striker, where he'll be very dangerous. But you have to pick and choose those depending on his skill set. Yeah,
and it depends what version of Rashford turns up as well. So, like, it is a squad game now. This is an important thing. It's not just about first 11. People might think, where's he going to play alongside Watkins or something like that. It's not like that anymore. You need to have squad players who can come in and out. They're in Champions League as well. If you were to play with him in the same team, I think he'd probably end up playing that left midfield role. But this is an example of the left midfield role, the sort of left forward role. But he's playing through the middle, you can see, right? Like we can say, they're going to get the left back forward to join in. But he's in this deeper position, which is not where I think Rashford wants to be. He wants to be higher up the pitch. He wants to be kind of here. But the reason this space is vacant, like we said, means that then Ramsey can run into that space to get on the end of a 1-2, because 1-2s are a really, really useful way of getting through lines, and then you can finish. But with Rashford there, you just wouldn't have that exact same thing. But he's more of a squad player. He potentially could be worth a lot more than he is what they've got him for. He is, on his day, a very good forward. So you get a better player in. Like I said, Monchi needs to try and improve their PSR position. If he can make the squad better without spending too much money, that's exactly what his job is, and it seems to be what he's trying to do with them. But a lot of these signings they brought in, I don't think raises them a huge amount of level. I think it just raises their floor rather than raises the ceiling. So they should probably have more firepower, which is what they need. And it's not tactical, it's just having maybe more creativity along the front line. But whether Malin will be able to create more than, say, I don't know, Bailey, we don't know. Okay, thanks, JJ. Well, as I said before, hang around until the end of the episode to find out if Aston Villa's predicted position has changed much in either of their tables. I was thinking, JJ, it's a bit of a shame that they can't just play Rashford as a 12th player. What a silly idea. Or is it? Here's Phil with a lovely story for us.
When was the last time your team ended up with 12 players on the pitch? That's what happened in the Netherlands, where the country's match officials need some help with elementary counting. An Eredivisie game between Fortuna Sittard and Heerenveen was entering the closing stages when Fortuna, who were 2-1 down, decided to send on a couple of substitutes. Owing to an oversight by the referee and his staff, they ended up with a lineup of 12 rather than 11. The error was spotted after 20-odd seconds, but moments later, Fortuna equalised. As you'd expect, Heerenveen boss Robin van Persie took it pretty well. We've got you covered with these stories on the Athletic FC newsletter. To sign up, click on the link below.
Thanks, Phil. What's next? Manager impacted section now. Manager impacted section. Few clubs in here that have changed managers so far. John, I'm going to start with you. We're going to come to JJ afterwards, talk about Everton and David Moyes. But let's start with West Ham and Wolves. Graham Potter, Vitor Pereira have come in. Does this change your thinking about where you predicted them after 10 games?
These are interesting appointments, I think, because West Ham I see as being quite different to the other two teams. With Wolves and Everton, there was a real fear that they could be involved in a relegation battle. They could sink into that relegation battle and be taken out of the league. And I think those two signings were done off the back of that, right? So what you want is an immediate impact from these managers who can then carry their team out of the relegation zone or out of the relegation battle and mean that they'll be there next season. West Ham haven't really ever been in danger of relegation. So this is, I think, more of a sort of long-term future appointment, where the question is, can we get Potter to do what we wanted Lopetegui to do, which is take West Ham from being a team who are, traditionally sort of bottom half of the table. Can we get them a bit more solid in the top half of the table? We have a really nice stadium. We have the ability to probably raise the quality of our squad.
Can we rediscover the West Ham way?
That's right, exactly. So I think that what I'm kind of interested in when we're talking about this season in particular is whether or not the two concepts here, simplicity and complexity. Simplicity, and both of them are, I think, really useful in football terms. I think sometimes we err too much on the side of saying, complexity is great, right? Because if you say, oh, my tactical system is complex, that sounds like you're smart, right? Where you don't want to be like, my tactical approach is simple, right? Sure. But obviously, the benefits of complexity is that in the long run, it should give you more advantages than having a simple system. But having a simple system, easy to learn, easy to impose on your team, and you can turn things around quickly. The big question then is, well, what about next season when teams are like, well, we know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best way of considering all three of these teams in particular. With Graham Potter, the argument has always been, well, he's going to be a more complex manager. This is going to be a more long-term thing. The question is, like, what does that complexity, like, what does it look like? What is it that he will give that you might not get from someone like Vitor Pereira or David Moyes? And I think what people generally mean when they say that is he will introduce more kind of different structures in build-up and attack, and have the ability to change his teams around quite regularly from game to game. They'll be able to defend out of different shapes. They'll be able to attack out of different shapes. And obviously that's going to take time to get to. Interestingly enough, Pereira and Potter have both used just roughly the same 3-4-3 shape right now. And I think they've both done very well with it. You can see that they've implemented the basics, the simple ideas very well. But I think the question for me is whether or not we'll see Potter maybe in the next season starting to get more advantages than you might see at some of the two other managers that we've talked about, because there is that flexibility there which allows them to just respond to other teams a little bit more nimbly, have a few more solutions maybe than the other two. Which is why I think maybe for me, I wouldn't expect necessarily West Ham to fly up much higher than the other two at this point. Maybe next season. I actually think the things that David Moyes has implemented at Everton are going to have probably a quicker impact, and we've already seen that, and I guess JJ is going to talk us through them.
I think we are going to hear about that. I assume from what you're saying that you are not predicting either of those teams to be relegated then.
Yeah, I think that we've seen a couple of wins now Wolves are the only one who I think are really in danger now, but I think they've got a good enough squad. I think Vitor Pereira's done a good enough job to actually implement his system and ideas. I've just watched back their game against Aston Villa, and I thought there's some really smart, out of possession ideas there that allowed them to control that game. And I think bring those two things together, good players, decent manager, and they're going to have enough to stay up.
And if there's one area of the table which you both got right from the beginning, and perhaps it's a bit of a hand, is relegation zones. The three teams you've predicted in all three of your tables now have been the same, and helpfully are the same as the teams that are currently in the relegation zone. John teed us up there to talk about Everton. My main question with Everton is David Moyes, hero, great guy, seems to be the best manager of all time. He's come in, they've won, 3 out of 4 games or something so far? They've shot up the league. Is this a new manager bounce, or is this just, are they going to win the Champions League?
Well, we're going to find out.
Right.
Maybe not this season, but we're going to find out. And there is a difference between Sean Dyche and David Moyes and what they're doing at Everton. And let's have a look at that. So this is Sean Dyche's last team at Everton against Bournemouth. You see it there?
Yes.
And this is David Moyes' last team for Everton.
Oh. It's the same. Is it the same?
Quite similar.
It's mostly the same.
Oh.
Which leads me to all of the following points.
Okay.
There are some similarities between the two managers.
Yeah.
The similarities, first ones you'll have noticed, are the same players, the same formation.
Yeah.
They both press high when the ball's going backwards, and they both drop into a low block when they don't have the ball. Their PPDA numbers aren't hugely different. PPDA means passes per defensive action. It's a way to measure the press. And they are the third least pressy. So that's some of the similarities. The other similarity is that they both launch the ball forward from kickoff. And this is important. Remember that one. There are, of course, differences between the two. So Moyes moves his back four to a back three. This is what we started seeing so far this season. And all these things will be relevant at some point. So when they go forward, what you get is that he's brought in Jacob Bryan to play as a right centre-back. He'll play in this sort of space here. And then maybe Tarkowski will take the centre-back bit. Pickford might move a bit further left, so you create something of a four. Branthwaite moves wide left, which of course gives a bit of license to Mykolenko to push up wide, which means you can get Njai closer to the forward, which means you can push Doucouré up a bit further as well, because you have a bit better coverage, I would say, on the pitch. And Lindstrom is a winger, really, so you can play wider. So you get this sort of front five. Then you can get a bit of depth and defensive coverage from Garner, who's playing some absolutely beautiful through balls in the last couple of games, and Idrissa Gueye can run around, break and play up.
I'm seeing Manchester City here.
No, it's not exactly like this, so it's not as technical as this. But you get these players close together. That's also really important, getting your attacking players close together. Another difference between the two is that what we see from the numbers is that Moyes' Everton, even though it's only 4 games, are playing more passes than Dyche's. They were very direct, Sean Dyche's team. They'd be quite isolated up top. They play the ball forward very quickly and try and do that press that we're trying to do, which is not very effective. And then we get launched back and they'd get it. So, but they were really tight in the block at the back. So it's hard to break down, you know? So they're passing more, but they're passing more in deeper areas. Moyes' team are passing more in their own half, in the middle third, than Dyche's were. It's not a huge amount, but enough to you can see the difference. So Moyes' team are creating more big chances. That could be because you've got more players close together. It could be because they're being a bit more patient with the ball before they get forward, so people are in the right positions to ensure they're in the right places for rest defence purposes, but also just so they can create more. So this is the kind of thing we're seeing. But Dyche's team is almost entirely reliant on set pieces for goals, which again comes back to probably what they're doing. They're being really solid at the back. They're leaving players forward who are isolated. They can try and get a corner. Then you use the big lads to try and score. It's not far off what Arsenal doing very well. They were overly reliant on it. So that's the thing. And you can see the amount of set-piece goals. They've scored 6 goals from set pieces, only 13 in open play. So it's been a big over-reliance. But the big difference is that Moyes wants his players to score goals. This is the big tactical shift. Is that tactical? I don't know. Because you remember I told you to remember about the kickoffs?
Yes.
Well, this is the payoff. This is the callback.
I'd forgotten.
Well, it's a callback. Here they are. Starting against Manchester City under the management of one Sean Dyche. The ball goes backwards to the goalkeeper, who then launches it to this section of the pitch. Man City win the ball. It just pings around a bit. Nothing happens. Observe. Everton under David Moyes playing against a rival team. Yeah. Leicester. They're playing against Leicester. Yes. The ball goes backwards to the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper launches it towards the same part of the pitch. Yeah. But the curious change in tactics here is that rather than allow the opposition team to head the ball backwards, David Moyes has concocted a nefarious scheme to make them misread the flight of the ball, allow it to bounce through to Doucouré, who then scores. Cuts to David Moyes. And using advanced technology, we can see what he's thinking here. He's thinking, misread the ball, yes. So this is what's happening. Sean Dyche wasn't doing this. Win the ball, yes. Now score the goal, yes. This is how David Moyes has fixed Everton. Right. He's making them better by getting players higher up the pitch, closer together, so they can combine, which makes them better, which means you've got more chances when you put the ball into the box. There's more players there, and you can get players into the box by making sure you're more patient with it, by building a bit slower. But a lot of what we might be seeing with Moyes there, and something what like John's alluding to earlier, is that it might be like a new manager bounce, which can give you like a newfound optimism. It can be that Moyes has deshackled them and allowed players to run forward a bit more. There are players running forward more. And in fact, why don't we just ask David Moyes? Because he did a quote. Well, this is one random thing he said after one of the games recently. Asked what he's done to be different. He said, "We encourage them to get more into the box and get people in the box more often, get more shots, get more crosses." This is tactics. You just tell players to get forward more, get in the box more, get forward more, do more of that. There will be stuff done on the training ground where they get different positions to help facilitate this. It's not as simple as that. No. But that's going to be the message. It'll be the change in the message from the manager that'll help them get there. And because it's worked already, players buy into it, you get a bit of optimism, you get a bit of momentum, and you can start to improve. And then players who have looked worse than they are all season might be a bit better going forward. But I guess what we'll need to see going forward is whether Moyes is the one that turns Everton into a team who climb up the table, or whether he's just there now to help make them safe like he might already be doing, because we don't know what Everton will be like in a few years.
I know someone who can answer that question.
Who?
It's Paddy Boylan from The Athletic, who's here to help us now. He's not here, but he's going to help us now.
When the Friedkin Group completed its takeover of Everton in December, it spoke about returning the team to its rightful place in the table. TFG sees untapped potential in Everton, particularly with the upcoming move to the Dockside Stadium in time for next season. But this is an Everton squad in urgent need of investment if it is to start competing. The aim for Everton this season is simply to avoid relegation, and to do so as comfortably as possible. But Moyes is not just a stopgap. The 2.5-year contract he's being given by TFG means he will also help them build foundations for the future too.
Hey, thanks, Paddy. Now, all that's left for us to do is take a look at the final league prediction tables. I want to start by asking you about Manchester United, who you both predicted to finish 7th last time we spoke. 7th. I don't think that's going to be the case again. John, you are saying that they will finish 11th. Okay, that's a bit of a drop. JJ, you're saying they'll finish 16th. Okay, so we're just going to ask you, that feels very severe, but perhaps accurate.
I think the underlying numbers are bad, and I think the actual numbers are also bad.
Yeah.
And when those two things combine and collide, oh baby, you've got a stew. I think the thing they've got is that teams below them are awful. So Leicester, Ipswich, Southampton aren't going to go anywhere. Wolves maybe will improve, I think, but they don't have the players to necessarily climb even further up. But when you just look up the table, like underlying numbers with teams like Fulham and Bournemouth have them really high up the table, and they're just not quite there because they don't have the players. Man United both don't really have the underlying numbers or the players at the moment. They've signed Dorgu as a wing back, which might help. It might actually make a big difference to how they progress the ball and how they play in the final third. It might make a difference, but I think a lot of teams sense they were a wounded creature. And
Will be coming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Well, I mean, you've gone a slightly different direction there, John. You've obviously predicted them lower than you did before, but you think they're going to finish 11th. Right now, the two teams are in their way of doing that, Brentford and Crystal Palace. I assume those are the teams you think they will pass?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I looked at this was I had Spurs and Man United as at the same sort of level, and I was like, well, one of them will probably... There's always a team at the end of the season that sort of gets their stuff in order. Mm-hmm. And I feel as though Man United may be the more likely of those two teams, so I just gambled on them being the one that jump up a little bit. I guess for me then the question is whether or not Spurs can turn things around. And the issue for me with Spurs is the injury crisis that they seem to consistently have. So.
Well, this is interesting. You think Spurs can't turn it around. You predict them to finish 14th. JJ, you think they can. You've got them in 10th. Bit of a climb.
Well, I think they'll get players back, and I think they'll just be better going forward. They either win or they lose. They don't draw. That's their issue. And I think as long as you win games, it's fine. They haven't also been called by the manager the worst team in the club's history, which is another thing to bear in mind with my placing at Man United.
They did just get dominated by Brentford, despite the fact that they won. So I don't know. It's definitely a tough one with the Spurs.
It's a really hard call at Spurs.
Yeah, the gap between brilliance and abjectness is seemingly paper thin at the moment.
Okay, well, the only other notable change, really, I suppose, is Manchester City. You both predicted them to win the Premier League last time we were here. That's obviously not going to happen. John, you've popped them in 4th, still positive. You got them in 3rd, JJ, ahead of Chelsea there. That's nice, isn't it?
I think they'll have a nice end to the season. And I think Forest, even though I'd like them to keep it up, they must lose a couple of games at some point. Maybe they won't.
Maybe they won't.
I could be wrong.
Who knows? I hope you are wrong.
Me too.
So that we can come back for a 4th time and predict the Premier League.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.